Good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Turner, and I'm the Managing Director here at Risk New Zealand. Welcome to the November Lunchtime Seminar, the final one for 2021. I would like to thank and acknowledge firstly the support of Risk New Zealand sponsors to make this possible. That's Marsh, CAMS, SIO Global, Insurance Business New Zealand, F24, Azenic, and Safety Associates. All participants today have been put on mute, but please feel free to type questions straight into the Q&A panel anytime during the session. We will be having a Q&A session towards the end of the presentation. So now on to today's topic, climate-related disclosures, consultation on governance and risk management. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you April McKenzie, Chief Executive of XRB, and Dr. Amelia Sharman, Director, Climate Reporting. Take it away. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Amelia, you need to flick the slides along. Well, I hope you're all awake more than Amelia is because she's not clicking the slides. Hello, everyone. I'm April McKenzie, Chief Executive of the External Reporting Board. Today, we're going to talk to you about climate-related disclosures. So on the first slide, I just want to tell you a little bit about who are the XRB. The External Reporting Board, you'll hear me constantly refer to us as the XRB, our nickname. We're an independent Crown entity, and our objective, our vision is that New Zealand prospers through effective decision-making informed by high-quality, credible, integrated reporting. You might know us for our accounting, assurance and audit standards, but we've got a new mandate now under a new piece of legislation. You may have heard of this amazing bill, the Financial Sector, brackets, Climate-Related Disclosures and Other Matters, close brackets, Amendment Bill. Well, that bill has now finished and has passed on the 21st of October, so it no longer exists. It's dissipated out to amend various pieces of legislation. And one of the acts that it amended is the Financial Reporting Act, where the XRB gets its mandate. And our mandate has been extended to write climate standards and into the assurance area, and also to write non-binding guidance on ESG matters. Today, clearly, we are going to focus on climate-related standards. That piece of legislation now has royal assent, so the clock has started ticking. So what is the timeline? I want to talk about what happens when, but Amelia, I want to go to the next slide and then flick back. So this next slide shows you who. Now that that is a piece of legislation, I think you need to be starting to think about, am I fitting into one of these categories? Are you a large listed insurer with market capitalisation over 60 million? Or are you a large financial organisation, a bank, licensed insurer, a credit union, managers of investment schemes, smaller side? When we're talking to, if you're a manager of an investment scheme, you're going to have to think at fund level. And some Crown financial institutions who are currently getting this requirement via letters of expectation. We're anticipating that letter of expectation to, in due course, refer directly to the XRB standards. So if you see yourself somewhere on the slide, then we really do hope that you'll engage with us and ask us questions in the Q&A down the end. We will definitely allow time for questions in order that you get the most out of this session today as possible. So let me flick back to the timeline now that you know, hopefully caught your attention as to whether or not you're in this mandatory regime. On the 20th of October, so a couple of weeks ago, the XRB launched the first of its consultation documents. These consultation documents are based on something called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. You might have heard it referred to as TCFD. The TCFD came out in 2017 with a report and a series of recommendations on a series of disclosures covering 4 areas: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. That 2017 document also encompassed quite a few pages of other material and guidance, but basically it's summarised in one page under those 4 headings. And we are following that outline as the government indicated was its desire to base New Zealand standards or align New Zealand standards on international document of the TCFD. So in October, we released the first section, which is what we're going to focus on today, and it covers governance and risk management. Why did we start there? Well, actually, they were the easy sections, but more importantly, that's where we think entities will also need to start in looking at what are their governance and management structures and processes, and what processes they set up to identify the risks to their entity of the impact of climate change on their activities that they undertake. So we have started there. In March 2022, we expect to issue the consultation document that covers strategy and metrics and targets. And then we will hear all of that feedback, bundle it all back together, and in July 2022 issue an exposure draft in our formal consultation process, and then with the expectation that we will issue a standard by December 2022. So what will make up the standard? So you can skip that one. Great. Thanks, Amelia. The framework will consist of at least 3 standards, so we've already identified. The one that we're going to be talking a bit about today, NZCS1, which is the climate-related disclosures standard. That will give you here are the things you must disclose. The other standard, the one on adoption, CS2, will be the sort of standard that will help you into the regime. So typically, an adoption standard offers provisions or clauses to entities when new requirements are being applied for the first time. Now, you might have come across this in, if you've applied an accounting standard for the first time, usually there are clauses that say, here, you can use these easy to get numbers first, and then give you time to put your systems in place. You usually get let off having comparatives in your first time that you apply something new. I'm pretty sure we'll give you that. I'm pretty sure, though it's an XRB standard, certainly we're recommending to them that there be no comparatives in the first year of application. Let's give everyone a chance to focus on these disclosures and keep moving ahead. The other types of things that you might find in an adoption standard are some sort of phased in application. So in those areas where we know there might be data issues or systems issues or practice knowledge, we'll try and develop a roadmap following consultation and feedback from those needing to apply it to tell us what they can do when. And we might talk a little bit about that if we touch on greenhouse gas emissions and measurement there at the end of this discussion. So the next part is also the CRDC, so the disclosure concepts. Those of you again familiar with accounting standards, you may have you might know what a conceptual framework is. That's where you're going to get those qualitative characteristics, things such as that the information has to be relevant, complete, free from any error or bias. It has to be neutral, comparable, verifiable, and timely. And in fact, the regime implements a time frame. You have to have your first climate statement prepared in the accounting period that starts immediately after we issue our first standard. So as I mentioned, we aim to issue a standard in December 2022, which means that the first accounting period or reporting period will be those commencing 1 January 2023. For the period to 31 December 2023, and you've then got 4 months under the legislation, under the FMC Act, to issue your climate statement and link it back to your annual report. So it's in your normal reporting cycle. And then the last thing that we will be doing alongside of all of this is issuing guidance. We hope that guidance will be iterative, kept up to date. It's likely to be sector specific, but that will be non-mandatory. The other 3 things will be mandatory. It's a mandatory regime with some relatively severe penalties, and the enforcer is the Financial Markets Authority. So that's the framework. Where to from here? On our next slide, you'll see that I've mentioned those qualitative characteristics already, but what can you expect from our standard? Hopefully you've already looked a little bit at the discussion document, and you'll see that the 2 pieces of the standard that we outline there, that we propose there, we've tried to give you some suggested words. They're principles based. They're definitely based on the TCFD, so get familiar with that. That will show you our general direction of travel. It needs to be user needs focused. Standard setters say that all the time. Easier said than done. So we really do need to engage with and hope that people who are investing will reach out to us, tell us and explain to us the nature of the information that they need in order to make decisions around their investments, and that an entity has explained clearly and thoroughly and understandably, in an understandable manner, how climate change is impacting on them as an entity. We are not doing this in an isolated New Zealand context. And on the next slide, you'll get just a snapshot of what's going on in the world. You'll get these slides after the presentation. I don't need you to be able to read all the words on here, but just a sense that to reassure you that we are undertaking our best endeavours to keep up to date with what's going on around the world. We are particularly focused on the United Kingdom, where they are bringing in a mandatory regime around about exactly the same time as us, and there's a lot about their system that is going to be useful for us, because the way they set standards and the way that we set standards and the nature of their entities, there's a lot of parallel. So we're paying close attention to them and close attention to Europe and to the work of an organisation called EFRAG, the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, that is setting up standards right across the sustainability area. They do also have a focus on climate. Australia's not on there. There's a lot of movement in Australia, but there isn't a mandatory regime, and their standard setter is not yet picking up standards in this area. They're issuing some guidance. And the other one that's not on there, because I believe it might be being announced tonight as we're asleep, is the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is going to sit under the IFRS trustees framework. So the International Financial Reporting Standards area, those, if I've got accountants in the audience, they'll be aware of the accounting standards that are set by the International Accounting Standards Board. Well, their trustees above them are setting up a sister board, the ISSB, the ISSB. We love our acronyms in the standard setting world, which is going to focus on sustainability standards, and has indicated it will focus on climate first. So they've established a working group so that they can, once that board is established, I believe they're interviewing for the position of chair and deputy chair at the moment. Once that board is established, they'll have something they can start with, and we're working with them to try and understand how their thinking is developing. So we are based on TCFD. We will take full cognizance of, to the extent it's feasible, of what's going on around the world, though there's a huge amount. but you can start at the TCFD area. Don't wait for us to issue a standard. So on the next slide, you're going to see the proposed structure. Don't wait for the standard. You've already got the first part of the consultation document, but you don't need to wait for us. There's a whole lot of stuff out there. Get familiar with the TCFD material. It's coming out all the time. Some come out just last week with new guidance, new ideas. You can start now. Getting familiar with this, getting your board and your risk assessment processes established and up and running, and trying them out. Don't come at this as a compliance exercise. That's absolutely mission critical. If you come at this thinking, oh, yet it's another standard from the XRB, let's just give that to the CFO. Nothing against CFOs, nothing whatsoever. They do a brilliant job in the financial statement reporting area, but this is going to take a more collaborative approach, because a lot of this and a lot of this information that we're going to be needing to think about, gather and disclose is new. So don't come at it as a compliance exercise, otherwise you'll be wasting your time, the board's time and everybody's money getting this set up, because what we're learning from early adopters is there are significant benefits to an entity in identifying the risks, contemplating the opportunities, testing their strategy, looking forward. So when we come to the standard, and this is all set out in the consultation document, it's going to have various parts. Each part, which again, there are at least 4, governance, risk management, strategy, metrics and targets. We'll have obviously a heading to direct you where you're going, and have a disclosure objective. So that will be very high level about what the section is trying to achieve for you when you come to disclose the information. And then it will have a series of more detailed, you must do this, you must consider this, you must look at that. And there will also be an explanatory paragraph. That explanatory paragraph is an instruction basically to say, you've now done your must disclose these, check it against the disclosure objective. Does it meet that objective for your entity? If not, add more information. You decide what you need to add. If it doesn't and you add more information, be careful not to overload and hide a whole lot of useful information. So it's going to be a real balancing act, making it full and complete enough to show the full picture and meet the objective, yet succinct and clear enough in order that investors and readers of that report can actually find out the truth of the matter and make their decisions accordingly, so that the decisions that are made based on this information, both within the entity and outside, are of the highest quality. I'm going to dig down a bit now into the consultation document. I'm going to do the risk piece, and then I'm going to hand over to Amelia, who's going to take you through the risk management aspects. Did I just say I'm doing the risk piece? I'm doing the governance piece. Helps. I hope I'm listening to myself there. So, governance. This section is to enable users to understand board oversight and management assessment of climate-related issues. You can read that there, but don't rely on these words on this slide. They are not the words proposed for the standard. They're not the words in the consultation document. They're just to give you a snapshot and a sense and flavour of what's in the consultation document, which we hope you'll take a closer look at and give us some feedback on. So consultation document sets out what information has to be disclosed, what has to be included when describing the board's oversight of climate-related issues, how they get access to information, how they're keeping themselves informed, what are they doing about thinking about these topics. And then it has a section on what must be included when describing management's role in assessing and managing climate-related issues. Talks about reporting lines. We stopped short of requiring there being remuneration linked incentives, etc. But we do ask entities to explain how they assign responsibilities to management and how it's holding management accountable. So that's probably enough from me. That's a very, very quick run through of the front part of why we're here today and the context in which you find yourself, and one little bit of the standard. A relatively straightforward piece of the standard, but please delve in and take a look. But given what this is Risk Management New Zealand, we want to spend a bit more time on the risk management section in the consultation document. So I'm going to hand over to Dr. Amelia Sharman. Amelia is our Director of Climate Standards at the External Reporting Board. She joined us just a few months ago and has an outstanding background and experience in environmental policy and has given a lot of thought to the issues of the role that transparency plays in New Zealand's move to a low emissions economy. So over to you, Amelia. You can talk and operate the slides.
Thank you, April. Yeah, really delighted to be here today to talk to you all about our consultation document. So as April explained, 4 sections to the TCFD: governance, risk management, strategy, metrics and targets. In risk management, a really important caveat to start with. Risk management in the world of the TCFD is not about identifying what your risks are or what your opportunities are. That's that when April talked about climate-related issues on the last slide, that's an umbrella term that the TCFD uses to talk about risks and opportunities. Risk management is actually asking about processes. It's saying, what are your risk management processes internally in your organization, and how do your climate-specific processes interact with your general risk management processes? Again, here, one other caveat: risk management is actually just about risk. The rest of the TCFD also talks about opportunities, but risk management doesn't ask about your processes for identifying climate-related opportunities. That might be a bit, the special fairy dust within your organization that you might not want to disclose. This one is really just, what are your risk management processes? So it's got 3 parts. Firstly, a description of how you identify and assess climate-related risk. Secondly, how do you manage those risks? And then thirdly, how are those processes around climate risk integrated into your overall risk management processes? So firstly, around identifying and assessing climate-related risk. The disclosures here are asking specifically about what are the tools and methods your organization undertakes. It's not saying these are the ones that you should use. It's just asking for a description of what are the ones that are in use in your organization. Another disclosure is around what are the time horizons that are considered in these risk identification processes. We did not, again, specify what short is, what medium or long term is. We're asking here for a disclosure on what is short, medium, and long term in your entity. Climate-related risks are often, by their very nature, longer term. So the idea here is giving the user, the investor user of the disclosures, a sense of how the entity is thinking over time about climate risk. The third disclosure here is asking about what are the value chain stages covered when doing that risk identification process. This is a really important one, I think. So say you're a company that manufactures, you sell widgets in New Zealand, but actually maybe your biggest risk is not from the selling of the widgets in New Zealand, it's from the manufacture of those widgets in a subtropical factory, which is actually highly exposed to extreme weather events relating to climate change. So this disclosure is really saying how far up or down your value chain does that risk management process extend to? And then the last one is how frequent does that assessment, is that assessment? Do you do that annually or, every 10 years, for example? So that's the processes for identifying and assessing climate-related risks. The second set of disclosures is asking, you've identified and assessed those, and then how do you manage those risks? 3 parts here. So how does the entity determine the relative significance of those identified climate risks? So you've done your process, you've maybe come up with 20 climate change related risks. How do you determine which of those risks is the most important? Then you've got your most important climate related risks or all of your climate related risks. How do you compare how important those risks are to other risks facing your entity? So for example, you might have some very significant health and safety risks, or you might have some, risks in other areas. So it's asking very much about how you understand and rank, for example, or what are the processes that you use about determining relative significance. And then the last one is, and then what do you do about it? How do you mitigate, transfer, accept, or control those risks? And I'll just go back to the first slide, because then now C on this slide here, how do you then integrate those climate specific processes into your overall risk management processes? This is a really important part of the intent of the TCFD. As April said earlier, this is not the type of thing that should be left to one individual within an entity or even one team within an entity. It's about saying, how do you integrate that understanding of climate change, the risks and opportunities across the organization? So here again, just a description of what all of those processes look like. So that's the risk management section. Again, as April said, these are not the exact words, they're pretty close. Go have a look at the consultation document. Each of governance and risk management is actually really short. They're only a page each. So hopefully you can get a really good sense of what it is that we're intending entities should disclose. And all of the, yes?
Before we go on, and sorry to interrupt you, but I'm just wondering, do you want to talk a little bit about the types of risks? The physical risk, the transition risks, because I suddenly became aware that,
thank you. No, good reminder. So in the world of the TCFD, so there's this idea of not just physical risks. So physical risks relating to climate change are reasonably well understood. So that can be things like sea level rise, the typical one, ocean acidification, extreme weather events. And in New Zealand, for example, there's the National Climate Change Risk Assessment that identifies some top 10 risks relating to physical risks related to climate change in New Zealand. But obviously every entity themselves in their risk management processes will have to look at the specifics of their entity to say, what are the physical climate change risks that affect my entity? Do I have factories in South Dunedin and they are much more exposed to flooding? Or do I have facilities that are integrated into the cloud and my server is in the Pacific Northwest of the USA and they have a lot of power outages? So there are lots of specific things. The second type of risk is this concept of transition risk. And this is a concept that was identified back in 2015 by Mark Carney, then head of the UK's central bank, and he's one of the key protagonists of the TCFD. And this idea of transition risk is what are the risks relating to the transition to a low emissions future. So these could be things like regulatory or policy risks. So there could be a sudden policy shift that means that the activities of an entity are no longer capable of carrying on. An example might be the decision by the government here in New Zealand to not grant any more offshore oil and gas exploration permits. That, could be a policy transition risk. You can have legal risks. So, for example, relating to litigation that an entity might face because it's continuing on doing something that is high emissions, has a high emissions profile. And then another type of transition risk could be, for example, reputational risk. So as consumers become more informed about climate change, you might not be able to carry on doing the thing that you're doing because there might be reputational consequences associated with that. The TCFD has a couple of tables about what some of these types of risks are. At the moment, our proposal is not to provide a specific checklist of transition and physical risks that an entity should assess themselves against, because, as I said, we don't think that that is necessarily specific to each entity. Each entity needs to look inside its processes and say, right, what are the actual risks facing us, rather than a generic list. But as April said, we will be providing guidance. We will be providing lots of references where people can go to start those processes. So I'll just flip through. So that's the governance and the risk management sections are not everything that we've been doing over the last little while. The XRB has been furiously working on all sorts of other topics. And we can talk about some or all of these. Obviously at the end, if you've got a question and we haven't covered any of these topics, just put it in the Q&A box. But maybe we should cover materiality, April.
Materiality. Well, it's a little hard to know what to say about materiality other than we are working on it. Materiality is a long-standing and well-understood term in the terms of financial statements and the quantitative characteristics there. And we know what we're doing with materiality. But here, where we've got mainly non-financial information, we're discussing the impacts of climate change on an entity's activities. The materiality aspects are not as clear. Some people may have heard about this term called double materiality. So that double materiality is a term used to reflect impact on an entity of climate change. So climate change impact on the entity and the entity's impact on to climate. So various other aspects of its carbon footprint and various other activities. What are we doing to contribute to where the world finds itself at? But we won't be necessarily addressing that in the short term, but we will be addressing the materiality of the disclosures. At this stage of the piece, I can tell you that probably it's looking like that the disclosures in the governance and risk management sections, because it's about just describe what you do, that all of it by its very nature will be material. So therefore, you would expect to say something on all of the areas that we've identified, even if it's to say, we do not yet have a process on this, or we are planning to do this. So it'll be a disclosure about where are you at and sort of where are you heading. So by their very nature, they would be material. But if you've got a view or an opinion or an idea on materiality, we would like to hear about it. XRB is trying to do this differently. This is not, we're trying to do this iteratively. What we've done is giving you 2 sections showing the direction of travel. We really want to hear back from you. What are the practical implications from that? If you're an investor, are you going to get the information you want out of these disclosures we're suggesting? And then we can take all that feedback and issue an exposure draft next year, so that we can then say, right, here's the proposed standard. So at this stage, materiality is a bit up for grabs, but our thinking is everything you see in the governance and risk management sections in the consultation document by its very nature is material. It'll get a bit tougher as we get into the tougher topics. Hope that helps. It's not, one level it's not very helpful, at another it gives you a sense of direction. I'm just going to encourage people to start thinking about their questions so that we can engage with you and make this as useful to you as possible.
Absolutely. So I'll cover just a couple of the other ones. So presentation requirements. The bill, which is now an act, does require the preparation of a climate statement. And that climate statement must either be in your annual report, or there must be a link in the annual report to where that information can be found online. And as I said before, TCFD, one of the intents is to integrate an understanding of climate change across an organisation. So some early adopters of TCFD reporting, voluntarily, reporting, they tend to do one of two things. Either they produce a separate TCFD report, or they integrate the disclosures according to the recommendations of the TCFD throughout their annual report. So the latter has advantages in terms of it being integrated across the activities of an entity. However, the disadvantage is that it's actually quite hard for investors to find the disclosures. So what the XRB is proposing in its current consultation document, that we would have some form of presentation requirements around how that climate statement should look. And if an entity does wish to integrate their disclosures across their annual report, that there would need to be some form of reference table somewhere so that someone could say, right, I'm interested in disclosure 4B under risk management, for example, where would I find that in the annual report? We're interested on views on that. And then on defined terms, it has been a journey at the XRB to understand all these different ways of understanding risk and understanding how different contexts use a lot of these terms relating to risk. We are really interested in feedback. Defined terms are important in standards because they attempt to provide a consistent understanding of what all of these concepts mean. So we have taken a lot of the TCFD's defined terms and put them, with some amendments into our proposed standard. We're really interested in feedback specifically on the terms relating to risk because they have been so different depending on the different contexts that people have come from. Scenario analysis. Oh, sorry, April.
Sorry, Amelia. I think we want to hint here that one of the challenges that we have had in the definition area, and in fact across many of the topics, is that the TCFD is a voluntary document. It was undertaken with every serious intent, but they weren't standard setting. There were not directors liable to some reasonably severe penalties for getting it wrong or somehow not complying. So what we've had to do is figure out some rather sort of vague, but loose with the use of some of their language and try and make sure that it's standard worthy. In our guidance, which is non-mandatory, we're going to be able to be much more expansive and descriptive, but we want to make sure that the standard is as clear and succinct as possible. So feedback on those defined terms is going to be really, really important because we need to know whether or not you're understanding them in the same way that we're understanding them or what we intend with them. I love the fact that we have a question, and I'm supposed to wait to the end, but we're going to ask it now in the hope that other people will ask questions as we go in this last little bit. Are you able to point us in the direction of some good examples of early adopters, please? You might be able to answer that one, Amelia, or do we have a list somewhere, or what have we got?
Sure. So there are some really good examples. So if you're interested in understanding how different New Zealand organisations have done TCFD reporting, there is a document that's a report that's been put out by the McGuinness Institute, and it provides a list of New Zealand entities that report. And it shows, you know, whether they have an integrated reporting, whether it's across a separate climate statement, etc. So that's just a general coverage of who in New Zealand is reporting. I'd say from a financial perspective, I would recommend going to have a look at the super fund, New Zealand super funds disclosures. They've been doing it for a little while, and they've been really open about the process of how it's worked in their organisation and how the challenges of putting it together. Then the second kind of group I'd say I'd recommend having a look at would be the New Zealand energy companies. So for energy companies, you know, climate, weather data, etc., it's their bread and butter. They really need to understand this. So they have been some of the very earliest adopters. So for example, Meridian or Mercury do TCFD reporting. And they, you know, even if you look back over time, you might be able to see how their reporting has changed. We are very aware that what is kind of best practice today in about a year's time is very middle of the road. So expectations are rapidly increasing. And I think seeing how, for example, Mercury or Meridian has changed over the last few years, you'll be able to see the evolution there. And then the last group would probably be, I think it's the 3 A's. So there's AXA, Aon, and the last one escapes me, but some of those insurance companies, they do some really, really nice reporting. But what I would caveat is that not everyone is perfect. They're not disclosing against New Zealand, you know, NZCS1, they're disclosing against the TCFD. So yes, absolutely go look at the TCFD, go look at those early adopters, and you'll get some really good stuff. But we are aware that the reporting against NZCS1, not everyone will have the same level of maturity at the get-go. We are aware that entities will be at different stages on their reporting journeys, and we do want to make sure that this regime is meaningful for the entities and that they are able to take up this reporting and evolve.
So on that front, there's also a TCFD put out several reports on what's happening globally with various entities reporting, and they've got some example documents and pulling from various reports to show you different sections. Go to the TCFD Knowledge Hub or Google the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, CDSB. It's running a knowledge hub. Type Google TCFD, you will find more than enough information to get you started. Just resist Googling too much, because I found it all a bit overwhelming to be in the first instance. There's just thousands and thousands of pages.
Yeah, the Knowledge Hub is great, but it is very extensive. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of documents. The TCFD status reports are the ones that provide information on, the state of disclosure. And I think, it was on the 14th of October, the 2021 status report was published. So do go have a look at that.
So along with maturity of reporting comes assurance. And this is we're going to pause here. I'm going to mention something for 2 words, and then we're going to move on to formal questions, because otherwise Amelia and I could be talking here tomorrow because there are so many things to discuss. Assurance, there is going to be a mandatory assurance regime. It's likely to, all things being equal, you don't require it for your first report, you're going to require it for your second report. It's 3 years from royal assent, no later than that. So that's 3 years from now, basically, which means in your second report. And it will be around your greenhouse gas emissions disclosures. there will be a requirement for an assurance practitioner to give an opinion. And there is also can be voluntary assurance over other aspects of the climate statement. Any opinion or any assurance engagement has to be undertaken in accordance with standards issued by the External Reporting Board, and we are starting a separate project altogether to make sure that we engage with, let me call them, traditional assurance practitioners and other practitioners operating in this carbon and GHG emissions world, because there's more than carbon. Operating in that world to find the best way forward to develop a standard rather than just take the one that we've currently got on the shelf and whack it out. We want to just see what works for everyone. But of course, there will also be requirements around independence and quality management systems. David and others, we've got this slide that says, look, there are a bunch of questions in the consultation document. Here's a couple of examples of the types of questions. There are others. Tell us anything and everything that you want to tell us, even if it's raising another question, so that we can see where we might need to develop guidance or make something clearer or remove or add. So you can email us, you can use the submission form. Do follow us on LinkedIn. We'll be making various announcements and telling you about various events and things through that forum. But be aware that you don't have to write to us in a formal, fully thought out, fully blown letter. You know, you can be much more informal. The comments are on the record, so I warn you that now. We typically, as a general rule, unless you're specific, they're considered public. So just be aware of that. But we're not looking for that very, very formal letter at this stage. You're better to tell us what you think now, so that when we do issue the exposure draft, we are sort of going to be hoping that we've managed to understand where everyone's coming from, and you'll see yourselves reflected in that exposure draft. So have we got anyone who's got some burning questions? Or we can circle back on something else. So,
one of the questions we were asked, we've been asked a lot, is how similar are these disclosures to the TCFD? So, and I think, you know, one of the implications behind that is, what could you have just upped and put the TCFD into New Zealand and made that New Zealand standard? And I think, you know, April touched on one of the reasons why we didn't do that, because the TCFD is a voluntary framework. It's not a mandatory setting. They actually are very, they use the same terms with different meanings, or it's not as precise as a standard needs to be. What we've done is, in the consultation document, we've prepared a comparison table where you can see how we have drawn from TCFD and other sources for the disclosure requirements. The TCFD itself is actually just 11 recommendations. You could think of it as small as that, but you know, again, there's lots and lots of guidance. We needed to draw from the TCFD's guidance and other things. I would say it is very broadly aligned with the TCFD. We've tried to, you know, acknowledge the fact that entities don't just operate in New Zealand. They will be needing to think about jurisdictional, you know, requirements in other jurisdictions, and investors don't just operate in New Zealand as well. So the idea really is this is aligned with the TCFD. As soon as the International Climate Standard comes out from the International Sustainability Standards Board, we will be looking to see how our standard aligns with that as well.
Great. Thank you, Amelia. We have a question that in one of the earlier slides, it mentioned an understanding of Te Ao Māori at a framework level across the XRB. And can we tell you a little bit more about this and whether or how it features in this standard? Thank you for that question. I didn't mean to skip over the point. The XRB as a Crown entity is really trying to up the ante with its new mandate. As I mentioned, we have a mandate to set climate standards and a mandate to issue non-binding guidance in the areas of ESG. Working with Maori CFOs and Maori governors of Maori entities, we have recognised that the ESG area and the particular importance of the land and the environment to Maori is that in our ESG reporting, we wish to start from an understanding of the Te Ao Maori worldview and develop a standard or guidance in that area for Aotearoa New Zealand. On the climate front, we have a deadline that the government has set, and we in all good faith are doing everything to meet that deadline. Even though the regime is triggered by what the XRB does, it's not stipulated in the legislation as such. But in all good faith, we are going to attempt to meet that 2023 reporting period deadline. So we are have Maori colleagues on our advisory panel who are giving us their input, but you will see more of that input through a separate framework, an integrated reporting framework, for want of a better term, impact reporting, quite know what we're going to call it yet, framework that captures the Te Ao Maori worldview for all entities. When it comes to telling their whole story and their social license to operate, and making sure that we are capturing that intergenerational aspects in this ESG area. So you won't see it directly in this standard because it's being run as a separate project, because we want to get it right, as opposed to this, and this one's got a little bit of time pressure on it. But we are working with our Maori colleagues to make sure we don't stray too far. I hope that answers that question. Please do write a question in the Q&A session down the bottom of your computers there. I believe you can all write in there, and Amelia and I will do our best to cover that off. We forgot to tell you, you've got to until the 22nd of November to give us your feedback on this latest piece.
One other thing we might had been asked questions on, which you might be interested in, is how does this concept of scenario analysis relate to risk, especially risk assessment? In the world of the TCFD, scenario analysis is a way of testing the resilience of an organization's strategy against those kind of extremes of future climate change. So if we achieved a 1.5 degree future world, for example, or maybe we go to a 4 degree world. So in the TCFD world, scenario analysis is not about identifying risks. You can use scenarios as a way to identify risks, but the key thing is around testing the resilience of an organization's strategy. We will be talking more about that in the March consultation. We've had a question, April, on what are the consequences of non-compliance? You're on mute.
Thank you. Ah, damn, didn't manage to get through without being on mute. Best place to look is the amended, to either look in the bill or, in the amended FMC Act. It'll take a little while for it to get integrated across. I can't tell you them accurately off the top of my head, but there's sort of like fines up at the $50,000 mark there. I think there is some, well, that might be on the assurance practitioner if they don't do something or you don't give information to the assurance practitioner. There is potentially some jail time from recollection. They're quite severe. The reason I don't know about them is because that's the remit or the area of the FMA, but those penalties are both at entity and director level. So I hope that's not what's going to motivate someone to comply, but for whatever reason, government or Parliament passed an act with some fairly severe penalties for non-compliance.
We have been talking really closely to the FMA about their expectations around how they're going to monitor and enforce the regime, because it links really closely, say, for example, with the guidance that we'll be putting out about how entities can comply. So we know that the FMA, again, their view is they really do want to see entities embrace this and do it well, make it meaningful for them. And that's the same at the XRB. When we've talked, as April said, we've talked to early adopters of TCFD reporting, and over and above their understanding of the climate risk facing their entity, they have talked about better understanding of their value chains and better understanding of how their teams work together, and all sorts of climate related stuff that they have found valuable. So we're really hoping that will extend from this regime as well.
Mm-hmm. But I'm hoping that people will engage with FMA early. We think a lot of merit. We'll be talking to FMA about our adoption standard, which will be about, trying to set out how to allow entities to mature into this. And we need to sort of talk about timeframes, etc. So we're hoping that they'll come out soon with a much clearer picture on how they will aim to enforce this. They might even be consulting now on that off the top of my head. Is there anything else in the last couple of minutes that anyone was, oh, here comes one. Consistency and comparability are important. You mentioned providing comprehensive supporting guidance and assumptions, including 6 specific items. Can you please provide examples of what you're thinking of covering? Oh, good question. I'm going to duck on that one and hand that one to Amelia.
Sure, yeah, it's a really good question. So in the consultation document, we do provide a list of things for governance, mostly for risk management really, around what we think will be included in the guidance. So a lot more definitions and understandings of examples of processes. We do not want the guidance, say, on risk management to be saying, these are the risk management processes that you must use. The idea really is to say, here are some risk management processes that that other entities have used, and this is the way they do it, and this is an example, and this is, and referencing to other sources of information. We do not want to rewrite all the TCFD guidance. That would cause a whole lot of headaches between us and the TCFD. But really, it's about how can an entity think about understanding what these requirements actually mean and how could they do it. So for example, I talked about the short, medium and long-term horizons. So there probably will be some guidance around what might those be, how other entities are thinking about short, medium, long-term, why the long-term is so important when it comes to climate risk. But we do have a question in the consultation document which specifically asks, what type of information do you think you would need to have to be able to make sense of these disclosures and to do it well? So we are really hoping that we get a lot of feedback and that we can keep that guidance meaningful and up to date.
We're going to try and write the standard fairly high level and allow some time for people to get on this journey and learn about this reporting, because I believe that many entities in New Zealand are not actually thinking about how is climate change impacting on their strategy and on their activities. So we are hoping that through that guidance we can keep it updated and iterative as practice emerges, and that will allow, not forever, for entities to get with it, to get good quality reporting, but a little bit of time for us all to get on here. We've had a question, and it's 1 o'clock, so we must let you go. Do you expect that in time the disclosure obligations will apply to smaller size entities? Any sense of that timeframes? Well, at one level, Michael, that's going to be sort of immediately that the regime kicks in, because one of the key groups of entities captured are banks and fund managers, scheme managers, and they have to disclose at fund level. So whilst the regime might not apply in warts and all, but the types of information that the regime is looking for are going to be demanded by those banks and managers to need to come up from those smaller entities. That said, we also are aware that MB and MFE are looking at doing a consultation soon. They were not sure about exactly when the timing would be, but probably early next year maybe, on extending the regime to either large private entities might be looked at, or smaller entities. As you're aware, originally the regime or the bill said this would apply to all listed. They've pulled it back to just large listeds. Our time's up. I better hand back to David. Thank you for that last question.
Hey, thank you very much, April and Millie. That was outstanding presentation. Taught me a lot. I'd say taught a lot of people a lot. And thanks for the offer to ask questions after this presentation. Look, as I said, go ahead and ask questions. If you have it and you can't get through, please just direct them to Risk New Zealand as well. We can pass them on. Just want to say another big thank you for the presenters, and thanks everyone for coming today. If you'd like to join Risk New Zealand and know more, please get in touch. I'd love to hear from you. So we'll see you at the next event. Thank you very much.
Kia ora.
Thank you.